Awesome. Let's make a start. Cool. So I want to tell you a little bit about what I call the long tail of hardware, and why I'm particularly excited to be working in the area of devices. You know, we live in this modern age and we've got smartphones and they do everything. What's the point in making new devices? Well, I still believe that there is, very much so, and I hope I've got some soulmates here. But I did want to share a little bit of my perspective on why it's important we carry on innovating in devices. So as I mentioned, there we go, yeah, perfect. As I mentioned over in Sky Lounge, you know, here are some of the devices I've worked on. I worked on a whole bunch of different kind of interactive devices over the years, new sensors, new input devices, output devices, programmable interactive systems. And one of the reasons I've done this, I did most of this work working for tech companies in the research labs. But one of the reasons I moved away from industrial research and come to academia is because I've become fascinated by this topic. I'm going to explain what it is. I call it the long tail of hardware. So as I do this, I'm going to build on a specific example, which in a way is what motivated me to start thinking about long tail hardware in the first place. And I'm going to end with some ideas about how we might realize this long tail of hardware. But the spoiler is, it's still very much work in progress. I don't have all the answers by any means. So I'm going to introduce this chap, George Zipf. Has anyone heard of George Zipf? Okay. So hang on, someone who I haven't evangelized this to previously, but I think I might have had a candidate on the front row. Who was George Zipf? Was it, no? Did I see it? Did you have your hand? Did you have any idea who Zipf is? Was what he did? I feel like you do have an idea, but you're just no. In the name, it's an unusual name, of course, so it might stick in your mind because you might have seen it in compression algorithms. You might have seen it if you've done data compression, or sometimes you limp or Zipf. So Zipf was not a computer scientist, though. He was a linguist working at the beginning of the last century. So he was studying language, and he became really interested in words, specifically words. And what he started doing was counting the frequency of words, and he would plot them on a graph. We call this a rank frequency distribution. So on the y-axis, is my pointer going to work? Oh, it's a bit difficult. On the y-axis, we have frequency, how popular a word is, how often it appears in the book or the document that you're analysing. And on the x-axis, well, at x equals 1, we plot the most popular word, the word that appears with the most frequency, the highest frequency, and the second, x equals 2, is the second most popular word, and so on. So the amazing thing is, if we have a book that's written in English, does anyone have a guess at what the most frequent word is in the English language? The. That is correct. Second most popular word is a little bit less intuitive, actually.
A?
No.
I?
No. A lot of people think and. Oh, but I'm blanking what it is now. No, it's. I know this, but it's not in my notes even.
You?
Of, I think it is it? Sorry, spoil the flow a little bit there. But I'm going to plot these, and the amazing thing is that if it happens 10,000 times, of, I think it is, it happens 5,000 times, and the third most popular words happen 3,000 times. The nth most popular word appears 1/n of the time compared to the most popular word. Isn't that crazy? I mean, who would have thought that? And like, what's special about English? Well, it turns out there's nothing special about English. You do this in any language, you will find the same thing. It even applies to languages, I'm told, that we haven't yet translated. There's some ancient hieroglyphs. We don't know what the words mean, but we know that they follow this pattern. It's called Zipf's law. It became known as Zipf's law. And even more remarkable, it's not just words. So it applies to populations of countries. And of course, it's not exactly true. If you put, China and India, they're quite close to each other. But you don't have to go very far, and you start seeing this trend emerging down the list. It applies to populations of cities within countries. So if you do it in the UK, for example, you plot London at x equals 1, and then you've got Birmingham, and I know what it is, Glasgow and Manchester, you'll find it follows Zipf's law. It applies to how much money countries earn, their GDPs. It applies to how much money people earn, salaries. It applies to how often your papers are cited if you're in academia, how popular your written work is. It applies to how popular TV shows are. Gosh, isn't that crazy? So to be clear, these things aren't necessarily exactly following that inverse, that 1 over x relationship, but they are a remarkably close fit to a more general class of curves which follow this inverse power law. Mathematically, these distributions are called heavy-tailed, which is really interesting, actually, because if you keep going to the right, there's always more stuff. They're not exponential. They don't tend to a limit. Doesn't matter how far right you keep going, there's always more. So TV shows, for example, if you make a really niche TV show, well, it's not going to be very popular, that's a definition of niche, but if you go far enough to the right, if you find enough people, you'll find someone who loves it. There's always capacity. So the shape of this graph, it does get quite close to the axis on the right-hand side. It is a little bit difficult to tell exactly what's going on. So what we do is often we plot this on a log-log scale. So on a log-log scale, it looks like a straight line. It's a little bit easier to tell that it's inverse power law. So I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about another example where Zipf's law applies, and that's the popularity of movies. So the line on this graph represents the popularity of movies back in 2005, 20 years ago now, where popularity is measured as the revenue at the box office, and it's only US, it's just US data in the States. So sure enough, the start of the line here follows Zipf's law. Now that you know about Zipf's law, right, well, that's probably not a surprise to you. Like TV shows follow Zipf's law. Why would movies not be the same? Something's sort of beginning to make some sense. But what's really interesting is when you extend the graph to the right, and using that data from back in 2005 US box office, it just falls away. So what's going on there? Well, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because movies aren't quite like TV shows in the sense that if you want to see a movie, you pick from what's available. You see what, back in 2005, you see what's on at the movie theatre. And so the distribution of movies, the supply of movies, very much controls what people consume. It's not just up to the people to choose for themselves. There just wasn't enough access to movies for this truly Zipfian curve with its long tail heading out to the right. So the difference between these two lines, what actually happened and what Zipf's would have predicted, what Zipf's law would have predicted, is what Chris Anderson calls the gap of unsatisfied demand. In his book, he wrote a book called The Long Tail. It's a really interesting book talking about this phenomenon. So if more movies had been available, we're pretty sure people would have watched them. But they weren't, so they didn't. And of course today, this is not relevant anymore, right? Today, we've got a lot more choice, and when it comes to Netflix, they filled this gap, and movie viewing is now Zipfian. And what Netflix did, of course, is they leveraged technology. They leveraged internet streaming, payment systems as well, because they needed to monetize it, so online payment. They leveraged recommender systems. So back in the day, when you go to the movie theatre, you pick what you're going to watch from the list that's posted, in big letters on the side of the movie theatre. When it came to Netflix, you needed a way to navigate all of those options, and so we had recommender systems that said, hey, maybe you'd like to watch this. And it's not just movies, of course. We've seen a similar thing with music and with e-books, even with physical goods. And the final example I'm going to talk about is software applications. So I don't have numbers about the shape of the distribution for software, but one thing's for sure, it's an incredibly long tail. So in 2018, so it's getting a few years ago now, but Microsoft estimated there were 35 million Windows apps, just Windows apps alone. And they predicted an appetite for 500 million more apps in the following few years. So how do we enable this long tail for software applications and for video content. Well, basically, we've got lots of tools and platforms that help us produce and deliver them. So on the left-hand side, we end up with these super popular applications that are used by literally billions of people every day. And as we move to the right, we get these kind of increasingly niche applications used by smaller and smaller groups of people, individuals. But I think the key thing to take away here is just because they're kind of niche, there's not like a billion users using a particular piece of software every month, doesn't mean it's not important. So, go back one. So on the right here, I've got some example of, you've got some research experiment that you're running, and you write a piece of software to run it, and maybe there's a couple of other people in your group that use it. So that's incredibly niche, right? But you can't do your job without it. For you, it's critical. So that's software. What about hardware? What about devices? And I believe it's much more like the movie industry of 2005. As an industry, we know how to make hardware devices. Of course we do. But as consumers, our choice is limited to the things that are available at high volume. The cost of engineering a new device, getting it into production, even at low volumes, or in fact, especially at low volumes, is just prohibitive. So that long tail doesn't exist. But of course, Zipf's law kind of predicts that there is this demand, there's this unsatisfied demand. There are people who want to use different devices, they just can't because they don't exist. So that's what I mean by a long tail of hardware devices. And what I'm going to do now is give you an example. The example is this device I worked on, actually, 20 years ago, called SenseCam. Has anyone who hasn't heard it from me heard of SenseCam? Yay! Yay, a few people. No, nice. So it's a wearable camera. It's a camera, it's a device. You switch it on, you put it on. It's got a wide-angle lens, so it can kind of see roughly what's in front of you. And it records images, still image, every 30 seconds or so. Let me actually got a slide here, I guess, which says very similar things. So once you've got it switched on and you're wearing it, it just works continuously. You don't have to think about it. It's there with no conscious effort recording images. And you end up with this sequence of still images, which is kind of a new type of media. They're not like still images you might imagine. Normally with a still, especially with a modern camera, it's super high resolution. You hold it carefully. If there's anyone in the field, they'll probably, smile or whatever. This is just taking very ad hoc photos. Sometimes they're at a weird angle. There's motion blur. No one's going to be smiling particularly, right? Unless they were in the moment. No one's, shaping up for a photo. You can also get, these days you can get body cams, you can get GoPros, which record video, but this is not like a video because when you look back at a sequence of stills, you can actually look through review an event that you were at much more quickly than you could watching video. So I used to think of it like the microwave oven for home movies. Regular oven would take you 3 hours to cook the Sunday joint. This, you could do it in like 3 minutes. So the amazing thing about this new type of media is that when you look at the sequence of images, if it was something that you experienced, you were recording it because you were there, almost invariably, one or two of those images trigger what we call true autobiographical recall. So you don't see the Eiffel Tower flash up and think, Eiffel Tower must have been in Paris. You see the ice cream, the photo of the ice cream on your shoe, which you would never have stopped to take a photo of, and you remember thinking, oh my God, I was there, I was in Paris, I was all dressed up, the height of fashion, ice cream on my shoe. So embarrassed, I had nothing to mop it up with. Those personal, private thoughts that went through, that's what's triggered. We call that true autobiographical recall. You're back in the moment. People remember things that aren't in the photos. They get stimulated by the photos. They remember what they ate, what the food tasted like, what someone said, whether they were happy, whether they were sad. And we ran studies with patients with memory impairments, in particular some patients with amnesia. And we did some studies, in fact, using a neuroimager. So these are images of brain activity when someone's in a scanner. So they're in a neuroscanner. It's looking for blood flow to the brain as a proxy for neural activity. And I've never been in one of these machines, but I imagine a lot of what you're thinking is, oh my God, because they're big machines and they put you in this thing and your head goes right inside it. And then everyone who's operating it leaves. It's not like the dentist where they kind of step back and then take the x-ray. They actually leave the room. And so you're probably there thinking, oh my God, what have I done? Is this safe? And And what we do is we put different, we show people images, either images from their own SenseCam movies, things that they experience, or we mix them in with images from someone else's device, and then we do a diff. So all the time they're thinking, oh my God, right, what's happening? There's a lot of neuroactivity around that. But we look for the differences between those two. And the regions of the brain which light up, shown here in the image, are the regions that are believed to be associated with autobiographical recall. So when you show someone these images, it stimulates their hippocampus, their memory. And the upshot of that is that people start remembering things. Patients with amnesia who would not otherwise be able to remember what happened yesterday, in the most extreme cases, certainly last week, last month, they can start remembering that stuff. They can start reminiscing with their loved ones. They can bump into someone they know very well and be sure whether they saw that person last week or it was last year was the last time they saw that person. So I've got a video here, but I haven't tested the audio. I wonder if this is going to play. Let me just introduce it a second. It's good. It looks like it's going to work. So this is Claire. This is one of the patients we worked with. She was working as a nurse. She got limbic encephalitis. She was admitted to hospital. It's a brain infection. She recovered, mostly, but she ended up with amnesia. And her particular type of amnesia is such that she doesn't remember a lot of stuff, but she can't recognize people either by their faces. So even her husband, even people she knows super well, he started wearing a special necklace, and she learned to recognize that. She sees that, that's my husband. I know who my husband is. So she started wearing SenseCam. We were lucky enough to be introduced to her, and she started using one of these devices. So she's recording some of her activities during the day and then reviewing them in the evening. And she might review them for a couple of weeks, every other evening for a couple of weeks. But then she doesn't keep on. She doesn't have to keep going back. That action of looking at, reviewing, causes something to happen in her hippocampus that consolidates her ability to recall those memories and recognize those faces unaided. So she'd been wearing this device for a while, and she was starting to recognize people again. And there's a little bit of video. This is from a BBC documentary about memory, which featured a few different bits about SenseCam. And they followed Claire and her journey. And she's describing this little clip, how she had to meet her sister. So normally, she would go to the appointed meeting place and she'd wait, and someone would eventually come up, tap her on the shoulder and say, hey, Claire, let's go. And she'd go with them. And she's describing how she had that experience of being able to recognize her sister, which hadn't happened for a long time.
I was walking towards the bus station, so there wasn't a set meeting place. I didn't know what Faye was wearing or anything. And I recognised her. It took my whole breath away. There she was. I knew it was her, and it was just the most incredible feeling. My sister. Faith. Oh.
So for me, that's one of the most motivating examples why having new devices can be a really powerful, valuable thing. There's a myriad of different cameras available, and yet there's just a simple thing like something with the right form factor and the right features used with the right piece of software can change someone's life. So there was an article about Claire in Time magazine. There were lots of follow-on research studies about SenseCam. There's even a SenseCam in the Science Museum. It's been on permanent display in South Kensington for 10 years or more. So SenseCam kind of made this transition from the prototype that we built into a product, perhaps not surprisingly. And there was a product called the Vicon Review. That company kind of spun out a new activity, and they made the thing called an orthographer. There was another device called the narrative clip, which was in the mix around the time. So this is all good, right? This is perfect. You divide a new device, you invent it at a university or in academia, and you do some research with it, show some value, you license to a company starts making and selling them. All's good in the world. But there's a but coming, of course, because none of these are still available. You can't buy these devices. It simply wasn't commercially viable for companies to produce them in relatively low production volumes. And yet I know there are a lot more Claires out there. For years after I did this, I used to get emails to like the SenseCam email alias saying, I've heard something about this device. I think it could help usually my husband or my wife, my spouse, or sometimes it's my mum or my son. sometimes as a researcher saying, well, I want to do more stuff with this. This is an incredibly powerful device. And so if you work in devices, the thing to think about, if you're inventing new technologies involving a device, if you want to have impact in the world, those devices have got to be available. If you don't get them out from the lab into the real world, you're not having impact. It's not like, maybe I can invent a nuclear fusion machine and we only need one for the planet. But for these small embedded devices, we need many of them. Can I take a question at the end? Is that? So if you're working in devices, you're doing research with them, probably right now you're out in the right-hand end, because until you've proven the value, that by definition it's a niche application. And that's where SenseCam was, where it naturally fits. It's in that long tail that's not commercially viable. So I haven't given you an example of how a low-volume device I think can be incredibly useful. The question then becomes, well, how can we unlock this long tail of hardware? How can we enable that? So to start unpicking that, let's think a little bit about the device creation process, starting with the inception of an idea on the left-hand side. And it goes through prototyping and then scaling to production. So it's kind of natural to split these, I think, in your mind in half, right? There's these two activities. We do prototyping and then we do production. But actually, prototyping is typically a much smaller part of that effort. You're focused on the form and the function of a new device. And at the other end of the scale, when it comes to production, I'm being a little bit cheeky, but it's relatively straightforward too to make copies of things. Once your supply chain is in place, it's largely a case of making more units, testing them, make sure they work okay. The biggest issue perhaps is when something that you use is no longer available. You need to revise your design for some reason. But where I kind of argue that those two steps are relatively straightforward, and the challenge is the bit in the middle where a whole load of critical activities, I think, occur. And they're activities you might not think about. If you've not been involved in device creation, you can understand, well, surely someone's got to build a prototype, they've got to invent the thing and try it out. And then I've got to go to production. I've got to go to a factory that's going to be like, have a production line making these things. But there are all these things in the middle. And established companies who go through this process, they're very familiar with these. Microsoft knows exactly how to do these things, how to navigate them successfully. But newcomers don't. And that's often why I think you say failed projects on Kickstarter, because there was someone who had a prototype and they thought they were just going to take it to the factory, and they didn't realize there were all these steps in the middle. But even if you know about them, there's still a little bit of a problem, I think, because what I'm going to do on the slide is estimate the cumulative investment that's required. As I move from left to right, I've got to spend money and time, right, developing my prototype, moving to production. And what I'm going to do is plot the cumulative investment. And I don't think it's linear. Have I got the build coming yet? So I think there's this sharp rise in the middle. So from a finance point of view, there's almost this kind of chasm between the prototype and the product where you need a big investment, a big upfront investment. And that upfront investment, you're only ever going to get that money back if you sell lots of units and you manage to take a little bit of profit from each unit and use it to recoup, to pay back that NRE, that non-recurring engineering cost. So it's a big risk. Like if you're really sure you're going to sell lots of product and make money selling those, then you can afford to make that investment. But if you're doing something new, how can you be sure? And so that leaves to very conservative. The next iPhone is going to be similar to the last one. Apple know how many they're going to sell, pretty much, because it'll be the same as the last one. If you do something really innovative, like Amazon did the Fire phone, was it more than a decade ago now? I don't know if you've read about that or remember that. But it was a complete failure, right? They had cameras all over this thing. It could have been a revolution. It turned out they wasted billions of dollars. And then that whole organization is burnt. They're not going to do that for a while because pushing that innovation is risky. And it's especially true in a way for small volumes. At least if you believe you've got a big market, you know you're going to recoup. If you're right, you're going to recoup that money. If you're not sure how big the market is, you think it might be quite small, it's incredibly hard to recoup that money. So there's one other thing about these activities in the middle. I think the terminology we use sort of collectively is quite confusing. So companies like Microsoft and Apple think nothing of producing 1,000 prototypes, right? Doing a prototype run of 1,000 units. But if you're the person on Kickstarter with a new thing, 1,000 might be more than your wildest dreams in terms of total production volume for the lifetime of the product. Your prototype, for you, the prototype is very much the first one. And of course, that's what the word means, proto. It means the first one of. That's what a prototype is. So I think we should be more explicit and define a new category for these activities in the middle. I call it isotyping. So isotyping is making equal copies of the same thing. When you build a prototype, your job is to make the first one of. If you don't like it, you change it, right? Each iteration is a new prototype. You kind of want them to be different because you're exploring the design space. But when you're trying to make equal copies, maybe it's for testing, to evaluate them, or maybe it's because you're in production. You want everyone to have the same, you want your tests to be consistent, you want your consumers to have the same experience. You don't want them all different. So you want to start thinking about isotyping, making equal copies. And it actually is quite hard to do. How do you do that really cost effectively? How do you run the production line in a small volume, but make sure that it's not like a craft production where everyone's a little bit different? And as a community, we put a lot of effort into making prototyping tools. I've done work in that space myself. Making it easier for more people to build prototypes, quicker to build prototypes. But I think as a community, we haven't done a lot of work in the isotyping space. Can we make tools that help people start that scaling journey? So, in a way, that's our mission in Pro². Pro², this EPSRC-funded network that's helping to fund this workshop, this summer school, is looking at the transition from prototype to product. If you hadn't, that's why we call it Pro². If you hadn't kind of realized that yet. And what we're trying to do is empower more people to scale up from ones and twos to tens and hundreds, and ultimately beyond. Initially, it's about scaling your prototype to something you can carry on testing. It's not necessarily a product yet. But the more experience you have in understanding how to make equal copies efficiently, the much better it will be if you do want to go to a factory, if you do want to do your own Kickstarter or so on. And that's something that we've been looking at here at Lancaster in particular. We have an activity we're starting up which we're calling the Devices Lab. And in the Devices Lab, our ambition is to do two things, right? It's to take individual devices, help people build those individual devices. You've got an idea for a SenseCam, we'll help you build it. But at the same time, we'd like to do that for as many people as we can, right? Because we love making devices and we want to have impact in the world. We will help you with our experience of making things from scale, right? Even to tens of millions of devices. If you think about the microbits made in that kind of volume. But we have experience at lots of different scales. But while we're doing that, we're also doing this meta level of research, which is thinking about what are the consistent challenges that people have when they start trying to isotype, and can we build tools to help them? Because I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. I think the reason that people haven't built a lot of isotyping tools is because a lot of people don't know about isotyping. The big companies know about it, they don't call it that, but the big companies have all the expertise they need. They've got it well optimized, and for high volumes. What would it mean to do isotyping, to build tools for isotyping, especially at low volumes? So I think that's the end of my talk. Hopefully it's given you a taste for a future world, right, where the value of long-tail hardware is clearer maybe, and the ability to deliver it is there. And then ultimately, products like SenseCam will be viable. Thank you. So we're close on time, but I know there was one question, I think it was a question, right? Yeah.
One and a half questions. So with the SenseCam?
Is this on? Is this going to work? Yeah, we are recording. Yeah, I think it's going to work.
Yes, it does. So it's actually 1.5 question. Coming back to the SenseCam, so my question is, what was the motivation for developing it from the first place? Like, did you need or had the clinical aspect already, or we just found it as an application throughout the way?
Yes, really interesting. So there are two different ways of doing research. Well, there's many ways of doing research, and one of them is, you're very clear about a problem that someone has, and you try and fix it. So you're talking to some potential users of a new technology, and they're talking about their pain points, and you think, I can fix that, and you try and fix it, and it doesn't work. You try to fix that same, in a different way. Another style of research, which is one that I just find appeals to me a little bit more, we kind of think of as curiosity-driven research. You build something because you can. I mean, obviously, you don't, you wouldn't be wasting your time. If you thought it was rubbish, you wouldn't build it. But you build it because you think it's interesting and because you can. And SenseCam fell in that category. It was one of my colleagues at Microsoft Research. She had this idea for a wearable camera, and she built the very first prototype, as it were, of the SenseCam. And by chance, and she was kind of thinking, well, I'm going to have all these still images. If I'm always losing my keys, there's probably a still image with my keys in it, and I can look for the most recent one with my keys in it. And today, we're seeing that now with AI, right? You see exactly that. But this was like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So it was pretty far out their vision. And cameras were getting small enough and lower power enough, and the same with the memory. You could just about think about building this thing. So that was the motivation. By chance, our lab was being visited by a person who ran the memory clinic at Addenbrooke's Hospital, the local hospital. And he was like, I think this could be interesting for one of my patients. And I don't think he thought for a moment that she would be looking through these images, looking for the one where it was very functional. That was a very functional use of it, right? Like run an algorithm and find the... He just had this intuition it might be useful, and it turned out that he was right. It just triggered, looking back at those images, triggered her memory. So back in the day, in the memory, so we didn't go at it like we want to help people with memory. We were just inventing a new technology. And it turned out, back in the day, if you go to the memory clinic, they would have experts. The countries, the nation's experts were there, and you could go there if you had a memory condition. You might get referred by a GP, and they would spend a day there, and at the end of it, they'd tell you what your condition was. And the patient sometimes, I was told this secondhand by one of the clinicians there, they said, "Oh, thank goodness. I've been losing my memory. It's really driving me crazy. Thank goodness I finally found someone who knows what the problem is. What do I do?" Mm-hmm. And they would basically say, "Oh no, we can't. We don't have a solution. We can just tell you that these are the things you're going to struggle with. You're in this category of condition." They would give you post-it notes and tell people to remind you. A lot of it's about prospective memory. Back in the day, carry a pager and have someone send you a message, but someone phone you up or set reminders. A big whiteboard in your front room, write stuff on it. So it's all about remembering to do stuff. Very little retrospective. Of course, you could have a camera, you could have a Polaroid camera and take. It just somehow didn't work for people. And the professor who ran the memory clinic just had this intuition. This might be interesting, and it turns out it was. Yeah. So the early prototypes were a bit flaky. In a way, you'd want your first prototype to be, if you spent too long designing it, getting it perfect, and it turns out to not be any good, you've wasted your time, right? So the first devices were a bit flaky because the isotyping process was so hit and miss, right? As it turns out, made like 4 of them. And so in some of the early pilots, right, we'd be talking to one of our early patients, not Claire, it was a different lady, Mrs. B, we called her, referred to Mrs. B. And she would be like, she didn't remember what happened for like 20 minutes of an afternoon. There's this period she can't remember. And when we talked to her husband, he's like, oh yeah, it stopped working. It's like I was fiddling to try and get the batteries. Eventually I got it working again. And then her memory for that event picked back up. Yeah, crazy. So was that, I guess we should think about time. Did you have another question? That was it.
I have one. So do you think that being backed by Microsoft Research was essential for this product to be manufactured in a proper way?
I think that yes, so is it essential? It was super valuable that this happened at Microsoft Research from my perspective, because arguing for the resource you needed to do the isotyping, because it was an expensive process, was possible, which it might not have been anywhere else. We had some managers who kind of believed in it when they saw the early results, and they're like, yeah, we want to do this.
Cool, thank you.